The Phantom of the Opera is sometimes considered one of the Universal movie monsters, and I get it. From the 1925 version that gave us one of the most infamous unmasking sequences ever, courtesy of the great Lon Chaney Sr., through the Hammer iteration with Herbert Lom and all the way up to the 2004 film that gave a lot of us our intro to Gerard Butler. Speaking of that movie, its inspiration and reason for existence was the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical that premiered in October of 1986 and has had runs all the way through as recently as 2021.
Still hungry for an introduction.
1989 was the beginning of its US tour, and we got not one, but two Phantom movies that same year. Phantom of the Mall, Eric's Revenge is cheesy and may just be more well known due to our friend Joe Bob featuring it on the last drive-in recently. Here in the Joblo Horror kitchen today, we're cooking up something good for you. Take 1 part Freddy Kruger, a dash of Canon Films, and a heaping helping of nonsensical gory fun. And what you have there is a recipe for one of the best horror movies you never saw. The other Phantom movie from that year, not the one centered in a mall, is brought to us by an eclectic group of people. The main antagonist is played by Freddy Kruger himself, Robert Englund, who is at home here under some fun makeup. The makeup is provided by John Carl Beckler and Kevin Yeager, who had both worked with Englund on Nightmare Part 4. Robert does get to play himself sans makeup a few times, both in the present and in the past, but we'll get into that a little bit later. The director would also work with Englund again as Dwight D. Little and would go on to direct a few episodes of the Freddy's Nightmare Show. Little is a bit of a genre renaissance man with credits on Halloween 4, Marked for Death, Rapid Fire, both the X-Files and Millennium TV shows, and even an FMV video game from the 90s. He would go on to stay in the TV realm with shows like Bones and Prison Break, among others, and the writer, or writers, would be Gaston Leroux, who's credited for the original work, Jerry O'Hara, who did the first screenplay, and finally, Duke Sandafor. This and the previous year's Ghost Town are Sandafor's only feature credits, but he does a good job here. The movie decides to take the story in an interesting direction, and that's not to say that that hasn't been done before with Phantom of the Paradise, Phantom of the Opera, and Phantom of the Mall all trying their best to make it different and new. This movie takes the character of Christine and gives her an accident that transports her back in time. The Phantom here is slightly different than we've seen in the past, with this one being a man that sold his soul to the devil. He wants to be a successful musician, so the music will be successful, but the deal is that Eric Dessler will be remembered for his music and not his looks. Dessler is disfigured, and some of the best effects in the movie are Englund putting on or removing parts of his face. Christine is played by channel favorite Jill Schoelen, who is somewhat of a forgotten scream queen. She had a hell of a horror run from 87 to 93 that includes the likes of The Stepfather, Cutting Class, Curse 2, Today's Flick, Popcorn, and the TV sequel When a Stranger Calls Back. She's a solid performer in everything she's in, and that stays true as Christine. In the present time, Christine is looking for the lost works of Eric Dessler with the help of Molly Shannon, of all people. Yeah, this was her first role. Christine finds a part of the piece she's looking for and uses it for an audition, but a sandbag falls and hits her so hard that she apparently gets knocked back in time. This movie doesn't actually have the famous falling chandelier bit that almost every other version of the story has. And the reason is that producer Menahem Golan, fresh off of the failure of Canon Films and into its new venture of 21st Century Films, ran out of money and had to change the screenplay around. And this also explains the additional writer and why one of them has a based on credit. The script is based on a script that's based on a book. And I still can't find the budget for this movie, but it sounds like Golan put a ton of cash into it, and there's no way that its $4 million theater gross covered that. Christine wakes up shortly after Eric becomes known as a somewhat phantom, and we see him systematically go through the standard horror fare. He kills a handful of people in grisly ways, and even sets up the new play to have Christine in the lead rather than the admittedly terrible person who currently held the role. The effects are firmly in the R-rated realm as well, but the movie was originally given the dreaded X rating before making cuts to bring it down a notch. While the gore wasn't exactly reinventing the wheel, I would love to see what was put on the cutting room floor just to push it into the vaunted X certificate. The other important characters are Richard Dutton, played by Alex Hyde White, Inspector Hawkins, played by Terrence Harvey, and Martin Barton, played by Academy Award nominee Bill Nye, who I assure you is not a science guy. White has been in over 100 projects, but will always be Reed Richards in the Corman Fantastic Four. Terrence Harvey was just in From Hell in a similar, if not more evil version of his role here, but also, maybe more importantly, a 1994 computer game version of Clue as the butler. Honestly, that's a pretty sweet credit. Nye was first noticed by me as He's Not My Dad in Shaun of the Dead, but hasn't shied away from the horror genre. He's also been in the Underworld series, the Pirates series, I, Frankenstein, and the Limehouse Golem. The movie moves along with at least the idea from the original stories and the many that came before it, and hell, the ones that came after it as well. The Phantom, or Eric in this case, stacks the deck so that his beloved Christine can take over during the remainder of the production. He kills a critic that review bombed her after her performance. He shows up to a masquerade ball with a callback to both the Lon Chaney classic and the Vincent Price flick Mask of the Red Death. There, he just takes the initiative and kills the original performer Coletta by taking just a little off the top. And it's here where the police decide to go full force. I'll be honest, I had always seen the cover for this movie as one of those super basic and cheap DVD covers that showed up on your Amazon suggestion list or in the bargain bin at Walmart. I always thought it was the same movie as the Dario Argento version that would come a few years later. I genuinely thought that the two titans that are Englund and Argento had made this weird version of a classic tale. I have since seen both, and this one is easily my preferred version, even though the Italian version is not without its charms, and Julian Sands, of course. The lead inspector and Christine's love, Richard, find out where the Phantom resides through the local rat catcher. They go down the sewers, and Freddy takes a page out of Jason's handbook by systematically hunting them down before the final confrontation. He even gets a few good one-liners in while dispatching the rat catcher and extra body police officer.
Then lead them to eternity!
The final confrontation in the lair of the Phantom sees Dressler take out Richard and wound the inspector before being shot by the man. Richard is taken out in glorious fashion when he's stabbed and then set on fire. Christine is able to get the upper hand and crashes a candle holder through the window, which somehow is able to send her back to her own time in the late 1980s. She hears the Phantom call for her as she wakes up and is able to go meet up with the present-day producer. This take on the story is somewhat original as the director of the play turns out to be Dressler, who has been surviving since his accident over a century before. We see Englund touch up a blemish before Christine figures out that the only way to stop him is to destroy his work. Being in the archaic late 1980s, Eric has all his stuff on some sweet floppy disk tech. She destroys it all, including a printed version, but not before we get some serious Kruger vibes when she tears off his face mask to reveal the final bit of well-done practical effects from Yeager and team. She passes a violinist who's playing some lines from Dressler's famous work, and we're left, like Christine, to wonder if the Phantom is really gone for good. There was talk for the longest time of a sequel to this movie, and Englund was all for it. The film, Phantom of the Opera 2: Terror in Manhattan, was written and ready to go, but kind of stayed in film purgatory for a long time. It's something that Englund was incredibly passionate about, and honestly, straight to video or not, that could have been a blast to experience and see where they took the character and the story. More Jill Schoelen and more Robert Englund? Sign me up. The movie itself doesn't reinvent anything, but it doesn't need to at all. It takes a ton of interesting and wonderful genre elements and gives us a fun and often forgotten horror flick that entertains as much as you'd expect from this era. Releasing in November of 1989, it ended a decade that is typically the favor for horror fans while not feeling like a product of its time. Well, for the most part. While it isn't going to end up on any critic's list of best movies of the year or decade, it should be required viewing for horror fans as its random assortment of talents and elements make it so much fun. It's easy to find both on streaming and physical, and should be one of the next films to cross off of your list of best horror movies you never saw.